Okay, time for something a little bit different on Sporting Limerick this week. Something that has plenty of Limerick connection in it, but it's something that has covered rugby across the country. We're now going to speak about a book that has been written by Liam O'Callaghan, a Limerick native and a man who knows a thing or two about rugby all over the country, and he has looked at it from an historical point of view. So Liam joins me now. I'll just bring him in here now. So Liam, how are things? How are you?
Good, Tom. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I initially brought the book up there. I'll bring it up for those viewing, and I'm sure anyone listening certainly have a look around themselves online and see. Blood and Thunder is the book, and Rugby and Irish Life is an historical piece, Liam. So can you just tell listeners and viewers a little bit about it, and I suppose in a broad sense of what this book entails, and maybe the level of research that has gone into it.
Okay, so the book basically covers the entire history of Irish rugby, Tom, from the 1850s, late 1850s, when the game first arrived, right up to the present day. And it's not like a typical sports history book that viewers and listeners would buy in the shop. It's not really concerned with the great players, the great teams, the great victories, and so on. It's more concerned with the role of rugby in Irish political, cultural, and social life. This is a game that's had to overcome a lot of challenges throughout its history. It's had to overcome war, revolution, partition, and the Northern Ireland Troubles. It's had its own internal controversies, like relations with the apartheid era South Africa, the whole head injury crisis that we're now grappling with. So I thought rugby had the most interesting story to tell. That's not to say that Gaelic games and soccer and other mainstream sports in Ireland don't. But rugby has a few quirky features that make it interesting. First, there's the fact that it's a sport that for the last 100 years has been shared by Northern Protestants and Southern Catholics. So two groups of people who don't have a shared sense of Irishness. And that's why we have all the sort of controversies with symbolism, the fact that we have Ireland's Call as this kind of neutral anthem that I'm not sure many people really like. And we've got a neutral flag for the Ireland rugby team. So I thought in those circumstances, as a 32-county sport, which isn't unusual for an Irish sporting organisation, but as a 32-county one where you have the Northern Protestant community and the Southern Catholic community coming together, I just thought it had an interesting story to tell. And I've been researching it for quite a long time, really. I wrote my first book on the history of Munster rugby about 10 or 12 years ago. And ever since then, I've been gathering bits and pieces of newspaper reports, archival material and so on. And it's only in the last year and a half that I got around to writing it, and it's out now. So yeah, that's basically what the book encompasses. And of course, it's also quite concerned with the class dimension of rugby, because I think one of the dominant perceptions among the average sports fan in Ireland is that rugby is elitist. And of course, in Limerick, since the very beginning of the game's history in Ireland, it's been different. The game never had that sort of elitist dimension to it. In fact, in Limerick, Limerick was the only place really where there was considerable working class support for the game and where working class men played it in significant numbers.
Yeah, that's from a Limerick point of view. You mentioned to me before we started, you mentioned Garryowen as a club, and I think you mentioned the 1850s there as well. Now, are they linked? Like Garryowen are a club that I know of, obviously are one of the aristocrats of rugby in Limerick. They're one of the, I suppose, the cornerstones of Limerick rugby. And what role have they played? And I'm sure there's other clubs as well. I'm just maybe if we could look at Garryowen or what information have you on them in terms of how rugby got off the ground in the Treaty County, in the Treaty City.
So Garryowen historically were of fundamental importance to the evolution, the kind of strange evolution of Limerick rugby from the very outset. And they were founded in 1884, same year as the GEA. But in Limerick, the GEA fell into disarray fairly early in its history. So around 1887, it split and didn't really recover until the 1890s. And Garryowen were different from the average Irish rugby club at the time because they had Catholics and nationalists involved in it at the committee table. So two famous Limerick men, Mike Joyce and Tom Prendergast, who were nationalist politicians and were involved in Labour politics in Limerick, were founding members. They were also heavily involved in Gaelic games as well. And the thing is, the idea that rugby was like a middle-class game or a foreign game, that's an idea that came later. from the perspective of people in 1884, it was just a fairly straightforward, simple and enjoyable game to play. So Garryowen was set up, and what they went about doing was organising Sunday rugby. So rugby in Ireland, the IRFU was almost entirely a Protestant organisation then, and Protestants didn't really like sports to be played on Sundays. But in Limerick, it was much different. Garryowen set up these Sunday rugby tournaments that involved small clubs from the inner city, from the laneways and streets of inner city Limerick. And a lot of these players were working class. Sunday is significant because it was the only day that all workers were guaranteed not to be working at that time. A lot of them would have been working on Saturday and wouldn't have been able to play rugby otherwise. So these Sunday rugby tournaments start in the 1880s. And by the time the GAA recovers, they're wildly popular. They draw large crowds. And by that means, rugby became part of the cultural fabric of the city. So from then on, from the mid-1880s, it took root. Once the GAA had recovered in the 1890s, it was too late. They weren't going to be able to attract those players back to Gaelic games because rugby was their sport at that stage, and they simply weren't going to give it up. And with its large, raucous crowds, its Sunday play, there was good. Limerick rugby could be quite violent as well. It was almost like Gaelic games under a different set of rules. It had the same sort of a cultural and social appeal that the GAA would have had elsewhere. So that's how Limerick became unique from a rugby perspective. And Garryowen organised the tournaments, and it was in their best interest to do so, because then recruit the best of these junior Sunday players onto their senior team. So Limerick was the only city that, for example, prior to the 20th century, provided working class international players to the Ireland team. A handful made it through, and they started playing on Sundays. There was a famous butcher from St. Mary's Parish called Paddy Healy, probably the only Irish rugby international to have a road named after him in his native city. He was a butcher, and he started off playing on Sundays for Shannon. Shannon then were a junior team. He eventually graduated onto the Garryowen team, got selected for Munster, and got selected for Ireland. And he's one of many examples historically of that particular pattern. So Limerick takes this really unique, divergent path from the rest of Ireland.
Yeah, you mentioned the working class nature of Limerick, and you mentioned these Sunday outings, as it were, and they were a recruiting ground for Garryowen. You mentioned raucous crowds. So do we have a picture of what these looked like? Was there 500 people? Was there a few thousand? What are the reports of the time, or what information did you maybe unearth on that?
The reports suggest that they would have been in the thousands. That you would have more than 1,000 people showing up on a Sunday to watch a rugby match. And you have to remember, Limerick at that stage was obviously Ireland was part of Britain. In British terms, Limerick is sort of a medium-sized town. It wasn't a particularly big place in terms of population. So to have, quadruple figure crowds showing up for rugby matches was a big deal. And that pattern, that structure remained in place for years. So some of the great clubs of the city, Shannon and Young Munster, they all started off as Sunday playing teams. And Young Munster, in fact, they were only promoted to senior around 1923. And then they famously in 1928 won the Bateman Cup, which then was the sort of rugby equivalent of the All-Ireland title. They won the Munster Senior Cup, which was one of the biggest shocks in rugby history that year in 1928, and went on to beat a star-studded Lansdowne team full of internationals in the final in Dublin. And I was able to unearth the social background of a lot of that Young Munster team. And most of them had again come up through Sunday rugby, playing for junior teams in that area of the city there around the train station where Young Munster had their heartland before. And a lot of them were semi-skilled and unskilled manual labourers. So it was a complete shock that they went ahead and won the Bateman Cup. And newspaper reports at the time even commented on the fact that the Young Munster players, the Young Munster team, were drawn from a section of society that didn't usually play rugby. And it's interesting that, again, just to recall something from what I remember growing up, Garryowen trying to poach players from junior teams was a matter of great controversy in Limerick until really quite recently, I think. So even that as a pattern is really, really old. It goes back the guts of 150 years.
Yeah. You mentioned playing, was it Lansdowne that you said Young Munster defeated in that Bateman final? So what's the makeup of a team like Lansdowne then, in terms of, obviously you mentioned skilled and semi-skilled labourers, and guys, I suppose, getting into
Yeah.
the trenches almost Monday to Friday or Monday to Saturday in some cases.
Mm.
So what does the Lansdowne team look like, so by comparison?
Professional men, stockbrokers, doctors, people involved in the legal profession, all that kind of thing. So vastly different. Some army
Yeah,
officers as well. So real kind of high prestige professions. So it was sort of a cultural clash, really. And what's interesting is, and listeners and viewers will remember this, some will at least, 30 years ago, Young Munster repeated the trick. They won the All-Ireland League in 1993, I think. And it all
yeah,
boiled down to a final match at Lansdowne Road against St. Mary's College. And again, against all the odds, because Young Munster had been a second division team to begin with, got promoted, and then won the league. And it was in 1928 and again in 1993 a source of huge celebration across the city. So Young Munsters in 1993 travelled through the city in an open-top bus. You couldn't imagine the winners of the Leinster Senior Cup going through Ballsbridge and South Dublin in an open-top bus. So the game is so culturally distinct in Limerick compared to the rest of the country, and it definitely has avoided the sort of elitist connotations that the game has, particularly in Dublin and in Cork as well.
yeah. You mentioned that's 93, so that's only 31 years ago. I still can't maybe fathom open top buses. Or that sort of jovialness, even now. I know clubs are maybe more, I suppose, secluded in their own right now, and they use their own clubhouses or their local bars or whatever. That their sponsors and stuff like that. But it seems a different time. But in the interim there between, you mentioned the 90s and we were talking about the 1920s as well. Have you anything to discuss in terms of Limerick there and its place, in maybe in terms of how it fed the Irish team and that period, because obviously that's pre-professionalism, and Ireland had its various successes in I suppose the Five Nations and stuff like that. But what's Limerick's role in that era as well?
I think there is a constant feeling in Limerick, and again, some of your listeners and viewers will be familiar with this, that Limerick players were discriminated against when it came to international selection. In fact, there was a perception among Limerick rugby people that they were discriminated against when it came to selection for Munster. So Munster wasn't really a thing. The Munster team has been around since the 1870s, but they only really became popular after professionalism. They really weren't a thing prior to then. Yeah, they beat New Zealand in 1978 and so on, and that caused a big rumpus. But I remember going to Munster matches prior to the Heineken Cup era, and the crowds were far smaller than you'd guess at a Limerick club match. So there was this perception that Limerick players were discriminated against. Even that 1928 team, only two of that team got capped for Ireland. Danaher Sheehan, who worked on the railways, and Ter Casey, who worked in a timber yard. And even at that, when Ter Casey was dropped from the Ireland team, there was the Limerick leader immediately came out and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that this is class discrimination. So I think Limerick felt hard done by all the way through, both in terms of Munster selection and Irish selection. And when the All-Ireland League reached its heyday in the 1990s with the great Shannon teams, with Young Munsters, and the great rivalries that emerged then, 15,000 people going to a Limerick derby, for example. When the game reached its heyday, Limerick players had a chip on their shoulder when it came to playing Dublin teams. And that's why Dublin teams, as I discussed in the book, when they came south to play Limerick teams, they played as if they longed to get on the bus home, They just couldn't cope with the ferocious competitiveness of the Limerick teams. And even though I guess the development of Munster rugby, the professional team, was necessary in order to, have a healthy game in the professional era, even though that was necessary, the price that we paid as a result was pretty much the loss of the Limerick club game as this kind of big beacon of local identity that it was in Limerick for so many decades prior to then.
Yeah, and you mentioned Limerick maybe not getting Limerick people maybe what they thought was a fair crack of the whip in terms of even Munster selection, but obviously Thomond Park has its place as well in history. So the fact that was in Limerick didn't lean anything towards Limerick. It felt Limerick people probably looked down to Cork and said, well, they're dictating. The Munster branch is probably, I presume at the time might have been led predominantly by Cork individuals, or certainly that was the feeling that they ruled the roost. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say, and it's fair to say that was the perception. It's not entirely accurate. There was a fairly even distribution of powers, but Limerick officials and Cork officials had a great tradition of bickering with each other. So the stadium out in Thomond Park gets built in the 1930s because Munster branch need a stadium. And it caused, by God, the financial crisis that caused for decades. So they build a stadium in Thomond Park. The Cork officials see now, right, there's a stadium in Limerick. We need to get a stadium as well. So that's how Musgrave Park was developed at great expense. And there was absolutely no financial justification for that kind of an outlay, but it was just one-upmanship, really. The Cork officials didn't want the Limerick officials to have something that they didn't have. And the game in Cork was a lot like what it is in Dublin, really linked to fee-paying schools, the professions, middle class, a lot of snobbery involved in the game there as well. So Limerick's cultural clash with Dublin was sort of replicated in relations with Cork as well, I would say. But yeah, as I said, the loss of the club game, and I guess the diminution of the All-Ireland League as a big competition has been the price we've paid for the success with Munster.
Yeah, certainly has. And obviously even the national team now, you can maybe see a slight replication of that in terms of the national team. Now, obviously the IRFU in present day with the contracts, the way that can often dictate, as we see particularly with Leinster players in the last couple of seasons, the RFU will dictate to Leinster. So it seems to have come back around in terms of that. But you mentioned even, I think HIAs, there was something that jumped out to me. It's something that is now the challenge is obviously there's as 100 and whatever, over 150 years nearly now of rugby on this island of ours. Like things evolve and certainly some things will die out because obviously infrastructure comes and all that, but new challenges present themselves. So can you open the door on that a little bit in terms of what the role there is at the moment?
Yeah. I think this is the biggest issue facing the game, the concussion crisis. And as you said, rugby's been around 150 years, but the game as it is played now is vastly different than the one that was played 150 years ago. And I have an entire chapter on the head injury crisis in the book. And I basically talk about how the rugby player has evolved since professionalism. So the average rugby player now is a good deal stronger, bigger and fitter than he was in the amateur era. And in some positions on the field, it's very striking. So the average centre, for example, numbers 12 and 13, for viewers and listeners not familiar with the game, the average centre is now 14 kilos heavier than he was prior to professionalism. There's also been rule changes in the game. That means there are fewer scrums. The ball is in play an awful lot more. And that means the clashes are more frequent. When you add into that, and going back to the centre position, the arrival of rugby league coaches into rugby union has sort of revolutionised defences and defensive tactics in the game. So if you're playing, again, to take the example of a centre, if you're playing centre, you don't try and dance around the opposition anymore. No, you just charge through the front door. So there's a lot more physicality, and that brings with it a lot more danger as well. And this will all be, like, there's not an awful lot I can say. I'm not a neurologist or a legal expert, and this is yet to be adjudicated on in the courts. But it is certainly a risk to the future vitality of the game, I think, especially if parents take a look at it and become a bit more risk averse as to what kind of activities that their children to play.
Yeah, and I think the NFL has had litigation, hasn't it? I'm not fully aware of that. Not a sport I overly follow, but it feels like it's potentially just around the corner for rugby. One thing I noted when you were talking about it, centres there, and maybe if you watch clips from the 70s, 80s, even if you take that Munster and the All Blacks game, the sport was about evasion at that time, wasn't it? It was about, couple of quick passes out to the wing, trying, there might be a ruck or two, but like inevitably there was a lot more running of the ball away from opponents. Now, as you say, there's tactics where literally charge up the middle, get a ruck and move it from there, and that's part of the play, whereas the teams didn't want rucks before. So there's the tactics, and as you say, the coaching element, and I think Andy Farrell is one, obviously with the rugby league background as well, who's influenced things in recent times. like the sport looks entirely different than it did, even, you know, as far back as, or as maybe as relatively recently as maybe the 80s or the 70s, you know?
Yeah, vastly different, vastly different. And that's what professionalism brings. Once a sport turns professional, you do whatever you have to do to win because you have the financial imperative involved in it as well. And if you look at those
jobs on the line, yeah.
Yeah, those fee-paying schools in Dublin, the sort of strength and conditioning programs they're putting those young lads through are it's elite level. Absolutely no doubt about it. Schools have such resources, the likes of Blackrock, St. Michael's, and so on, that they can map out one of these young lads' entire weeks in terms of doing video analysis, strength and conditioning, all that kind of thing. These are professional setups. And Ireland has benefited from that because still the international team is very reliant on players that come from fee-paying schools in Dublin. But it'll be interesting to see how things evolve, especially in light of the head injury crisis that's currently, as I said, about to be litigated in the courts.
Yeah, absolutely. Liam, the book is, as you said at the start, it's already available. I'll just bring it back on screen so people can familiarise themselves. One last point to make on it, obviously, you've ended up with a Limerick man on the cover there, the famous Ginger, or Jerry McLaughlin, and he's alongside Moss Keane. I suppose two icons of their own era, and I suppose have carried their own history as well, haven't they, into modern day as well?
They have, and what's good is they didn't come from conventional rugby backgrounds either. You know, Jerry McLaughlin is a Limerick man, of course, school teacher, I think, and Moss Keane was from an agricultural Gaelic football background in Kerry. So in the same way that my background isn't conventionally rugby, those two players were pretty much the same as well.
Yeah, okay. So can you tell us, Blood and Thunder, how much is it retailing at? Where can people get it, or can they even order it online? What's the best way to get a hold of a copy for themselves, or even a family member who may be interested?
So in Limerick, if you pop into any bookshops, Eason's, O'Mahony's, wherever, or it can be bought online as well.
Super. Thanks very much, Liam.